Hi, I'm Amanda, holistic biopsychosocial therapist, leadership coach, and trauma specialist. And for those of you who don't know me, I just want to give you a little background. So I began my career in the corporate world working in Chicago. I worked as a patient care consultant and a program director, mostly working with dialysis clinics and setting up holistic programs to support persons with kidney disease. So we were setting up programs focused on nutrition, focused on depression management, and really just trying to take a more holistic view, a holistic approach to supporting people with chronic illness to help keep them out of the hospital and hopefully reduce their symptoms. I loved that work so much, but I did find that my work was a bit limited by industry norms. So I decided to join the Peace Corps and went to South Africa in 2013. And it was there that I met David Patient and Neil Orr. David Patient was a social development pioneer. He was one of the first people to be diagnosed with HIV in the 80s. And he was told back in 83 that he only had 6 months to live. However, he ended up living another 34 years. And that was before there were any effective pharmaceuticals on the market. So he pioneered his treatment plans from a holistic approach. And later he met Neil Orr, who is another mentor of mine, who is a psychoneuroimmunologist. So he was on the forefront of mind-body science when the scientific community was actually just beginning to recognize the correlation between the mind and the body. And I learned so much through that apprenticeship. It also taught me how much overworking and overstimulation was affecting my own health. So this is a battle that I know so many of you really understand. We are, especially the very ambitious people, right? We love that feeling of being in a creative space, working on a new project, bringing something to fruition and completion. It's an amazing energy, and it can often be an addictive energy as well. Sometimes we don't realize it, but we're actually getting addicted to the stress hormones that we use to keep that inner drive going. And over time, this wreaks havoc on our psyche, on our bodies, and on our spirit. And it can actually really disrupt our relationships, because when we are in a state of overstimulation, it affects our brain in such a way that our social engagement system is really offline. So we're not as great of listeners. We're not as great at empathizing. We're not as great at being fully present with our loved ones. And I'm guessing that some of these reasons are why you showed up today. So thank you for coming. And today we're going to talk about psychoneurology, the mind-body science of overstimulation, and how it affects our health and relationships. Okay? So let's take a moment before we dive into the meat of the material. Let's take a moment and just place your hand over your heart or on your chest. And just take 3 breaths. Notice for yourself how your inner state begins to shift in just that short amount of time of just creating the space to feel. It's very different from working from an inner space that feels like we're scrambling and hustling. So as you continue taking those breaths, can you begin to feel more of your inner energy? Do you feel more connected to your essence? That energy that radiates from the core of your being. When we can feel that energy, This is how it feels to be in alignment with ourselves. And when this feeling is unnoticeable, oftentimes it means that we're actually leading our lives with anxiety, or we're living perhaps or performing from a deep fear of imperfection, and perhaps fearing that we're not going to get the admiration or the validation for a job well done if we don't perform to perfection. Which is interesting, because does perfection actually exist? Yeah, and the fear of imperfection can actually be a terrifying feeling for us industrious types, right? So even though we may be extremely successful on the outside, performing at a high level of responsibility, achieving all of the goals that we set for ourselves, this can really feed our identities and make us feel like, wow, look at what I'm able to accomplish. And we believe that we're very confident and that success equals confidence. But if we check in with our inner energy, we might find that there's actually an underlying fear that's driving our performance. And that can be really terrifying for us to recognize, right? No one who sees themselves as a confident, successful professional really wants to also look at the fact that, hey, I might actually be overworking because I'm insecure about things. But the pathway to a balanced life, the pathway to a balanced psyche and body, requires self-honesty, right? So we might have a lot of insecurities that are hiding that we've never fully acknowledged. And those insecurities could be driving us into immense amount of stress, right? So it might not just be the job that's so demanding. It might be the underlying insecurities that are intertwined in the work that we're doing. So I know that was heavy. So let's just, again, place your hand on your heart and just take a breath. Regardless of any insecurities or fears or stress, the truth remains that you are a natural born leader. And to transmit the highest quality of your leadership, you must be able to feel your inner energy, to be able to return to this place of vitality within you. When the feeling of that subtle life force is missing, it's a cue that you're misaligned. It's a cue that we might be pushing against a stone and producing from a state that actually feels like inner scarcity. So even though we're generating abundance in the outer world, our inner world may be doing that from a place of inner scarcity, not having enough time, afraid that we won't crush the sales goal this year, not doing enough to get the promotion, right? So it can be helpful to see what inner scarcity is taking place beneath the surface. Are we trying to fit into the world instead of simply contributing our unique genius as a gift to the world? Very different feeling. In one scenario, we get to be ourselves fully. In the other scenario, we have to tailor who we are and how we present ourselves. So what if every new task began with a breather and we took just a moment to feel our creativity, to connect with our vision, and to really sense the natural born leadership that dwells inside of us? If we connected with that feeling of our inner gifts, and then we allow that energy to lead us into our day, to have that feeling, that knowing, that connection to our inner gifts be guiding every word we write, every pitch we make, and every dollar we earn. What would that shift from inner scarcity to inner wealth feel like inside of your mind and body? How might it help you resolve struggles that you're having in your relationships? Coming from a place of feeling fully connected and present within yourself versus a state of overwhelm and can't slow down. And how might working from this state of inner wealth actually help us evolve our culture, heal our sicknesses, and inspire new solutions? This is the world that I wish to create with you. And so let us begin the exploration of today's topic. All right, so we're talking about overstimulation. Let me just pull up the slide here. One second. Okay, so overstimulation defined when your senses are overloaded with stimuli, right? Making it difficult or sometimes impossible to process your experience. And this stimulation is related to data. So every email that pops up, every notification that we hear on our phone, just the sound of the notifications, the images on a screen, if we're scrolling feeds, the news feeds or social media or whatever it is, all of those images are coming in, and that is information that your brain has to process as well. Your emotional experiences, how attached you are to the way things go with a business deal at work, right? Or what's going on in your personal life when you're juggling the fires that you're putting out at work, but also what's happening with the children at home. Sensory input, right? So this could just be when you're going to lunch and you walk into the restaurant and the music is blaring. Your body and your nervous system have to process all of that. Sitting in rush hour traffic, your body, your nervous system, your brain is processing all of this. And of course, work-life demands. And then we have societal expectations. Are you doing enough? Right? Some of us, we live with having goals and certain timelines for our life and all of that societal pressure. And so we're processing the feelings around that on a day-to-day basis. So that's a lot. And it's so much more than what our ancestors had to process on a day-to-day basis because we're living in the modern world connected to technology. Okay. So let's talk about neuroception. So neural circuits distinguish whether situations or people are safe, dangerous, or threatening. And this happens all the time. Anytime you step into a business meeting, you are sensing, are people in here happy? Are they concerned? Is there urgency? Are we going to put out a fire today? You can already feel that through your neuroception, through your sensory system before anybody even speaks. So you're already processing this information. And you're processing it also through the lens of your individual perception. So depending on what happened that morning with your children or your husband or wife before you came to work that day, you could be in a state of where you're already a bit overstimulated, right? Or let's say you grew up in an environment where your parents demanded perfection. And so you are hardwired to actually fear being imperfect or fear criticism. And you are hardwired for that. So there's an underlying stress and anxiety that you're carrying around before you even walk into the office. So there's all of this taking place that actually is going to filter your perception of what takes place in a day's time, right? Now, your perception and your ability to process your experiences is also affected by whether or not you have past trauma. And, past trauma does not necessarily mean that you had a horrific event happen to you, violent or abusive event. Trauma is just something that happened that changed the way your brain works, something that happened that shifted the way you perceive the world, that shifted what you perceive as threatening or not. Right. And so everybody has an element of that type of conditioning. So just one example here, high pressure work environments that use competition and intimidation. A lot of times people perceive this as safe, but in reality, it is changing your brain. It's changing your perception of what is acceptable, of what is a healthy environment. Right? So competition and intimidation to the nervous system and to the brain are not safe. But we live in a world where we've kind of accepted this as just part of life. And so, you may not be able to change your environment, right? But you may be able to set healthy boundaries or have certain rituals set up for yourself that allow you to fully process the events and the energies that were projected onto you throughout the day in that environment. So we'll talk about all of this stuff in more depth and in future videos. Okay. Another example, our past experiences actually change the way we perceive the world. So your neuroception, so what you perceive as safe or dangerous, is shaped by your past. And depending on what you experienced in the past, you might perceive something as safe that's actually very unhealthy, right? So just like the example I gave. Another example is, we perceive imperfection as a threat because we fear that we will not be loved, admired, or accepted as anything less than perfect. And this leads to overworking. But overworking is actually more dangerous than being imperfect. But we don't see it that way because we're hardwired to believe that being imperfect is the greatest threat, right? So again, much of this links back to childhood dynamics with our caregivers and what we observed in our parents. So how does stress affect your nervous system? And just take a moment to consider that. During the days, do you feel like you are running on adrenaline? Do you sometimes skip meals or have irregular meal times? Do you feel like you're crashing in the middle of the afternoon? Right? Or do sometimes you feel like you're holding your breath? Right? So all of these are signs that our nervous system is being impacted by our lifestyle, right? By our relationship with the world. So it's not about just the job that you work, right? We're not saying your job is inherently unhealthy. What we are suggesting, or what I'm suggesting, is that your relationship to that job could be unhealthy, right? So this is not so much about blowing up your life and quitting your job and moving to some remote part of the world. It is about checking in to see what type of relationship you have with your work life, and where are the opportunities for you to shift that relationship, to heal it or evolve it so that you can experience more health and vitality in your psyche, in your body, and in your relationships. Okay. So here we have a photo of the polyvagal ladder of arousal. And Stephen Porges actually founded polyvagal theory. And today we're just having a look. This image is adapted from the polyvagal theory in therapy by Deb Dana. And what we're seeing here is that this is how our nervous system behaves. You can see at the bottom here When we go into what's called dorsal vagal activation, this would be considered hypo-aroused, so under-aroused. We might enter this state and feel numb, collapsed, and shut down. So for a lot of people, they overwork, right? They're running on adrenaline and cortisol, overworking, and then they have these periods of crashing and burning. And this can be really challenging for people. It can feel or manifest as depression, as wondering what's wrong with us. Why don't we feel motivated? Why don't we feel connected to the world? Why don't we want to connect with our loved ones? And so here the attitude can feel very much like, I am buried under a huge load and I cannot get out. I am alone in my despair. The world is empty, dead, and dark. So just take note if that's something that you feel from time to time, because it may not be a clinical depression. It may just actually be that your nervous system is running in a very imbalanced way. And to protect you from doing more harm by overworking or being overstimulated, your nervous system collapses, forcing you into rest, right? So we really need to understand our nervous system in these various states before we go allowing someone to slap a diagnosis on us and medicating our symptoms, because the medication does not work when there is an underlying trauma or when your nervous system is continuing to operate in an imbalanced state, right? That's why so many people who are on meds actually end up having breakthrough symptoms later, because they're not changing their lifestyle. They're trying to medicate the symptom, and the symptom is actually a messenger. It's your body telling you you did too much or that you need more nourishment and self-care. Okay. Then we have sympathetic activation. And so many of you know this as fight flight. In this state, we feel mobilized. We might even feel a little agitated or frantic. I would say that a lot of high-level professionals and leaders with lots of responsibility and extremely busy schedules are probably running around in this state, right? So fight, flight, get the job done, put out the next fire. Where's the next thing that I need to respond to? It's very hyper alert, right? And it can feel really good to be in this state. A lot of people can actually get very addicted to the stress hormones that are being that are surging through our brain and body at this time, because it's so mobilizing. It can feel like inspiration. It can feel like, we just have this endless momentum or force within us that just keeps us driving forward. And we live in a society in which living in this state has been absolutely glorified and romanticized. We see it as almost a status symbol, but in actuality, there's a different experience that's happening within your body, right? So let's just take a look here at the attitude here. Attitude: I am getting overwhelmed and having a hard time keeping up. I feel anxious and irritated. The world seems dangerous, chaotic, and unfriendly. Yeah. So we may not even recognize that whenever we're in that state, because we're so hyper focused on what we're doing. But you'll recognize it when you have zero patience when you're sitting in traffic, when you have zero patience to actually sit down at lunch and chew your food, right? When you are overwhelmed and you can't stand, standing in line for a few minutes, just, or you can't sit still, right? You might be kind of jumpy and just constantly checking the phone. You can't be present in your body. These are all signs that there's actually a great imbalance happening at the level of your psyche and body. And what's actually really sad about this being the norm for us is that when we are in this sympathetic activation, your social engagement center of your brain is offline, meaning that you do not have the appropriate brain chemistry and sensory perception to actually connect socially in a meaningful way, in a way that you're actually feeling the experience versus just sitting there, being in your mind, maybe being somewhere else, thinking about something else, or going through the motions. And, how many times have we had conflict in relationships because someone felt like we were in another place, right? Or we weren't fully present, or we feel like we're losing the spark in our romantic connections because we are unable to really, really experience the depth of connection when we're in that state. However, if you have a practice in place and you are able to switch gears, to shift from sympathetic to down regulate your nervous system, you can come into this place of ventral vagal activation. And in this state, you're going to feel safe. You're going to feel social. You're going to be engaged in a meaningful way. And the attitude here is, I'm feeling at ease and I can manage whatever comes my way. I feel empowered and connected. I see the big picture and connect to the world and people in it. Okay. So those are the days when, you're whistling on your way to go get your latte, and you're, making small talk with the person at the counter. You're giving smiles at your coworkers. A lot of people, interestingly, on, casual Friday, everyone's in more of this mood, right? We can feel it in the office because everybody knows they're going to get a break from the grind over the weekend. And so you can actually feel when people have shifted into this state. Okay. So one of the tools that I give my clients is a way of tracking their nervous system so that you can tell day to day which of those states along the polyvagal ladder you're spending most of your time in. You can tell which of those states you're getting stuck in, and then you can develop practices to create more regularity, right? You create more balance so that you can be in your life the way you want to be, rather than getting riveted to a nervous system state that's going to cut you off from those meaningful moments with your family, right? Or where you have a whole weekend to yourself, but you are still thinking about work and in an agitated state, right? Or maybe, feeling so tired and fatigued from overworking all week that you can't connect with life. So tracking your nervous system, a very important tool. Write that down right now if that's something that you want to learn how to do, and reach out to me because it's one of the first things that I support clients in doing. Okay. So let's talk a little more about overstimulation and the nervous system. So we have the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve and the longest nerve in the body. It's actually a pair of nerves, and they emerge from the top of the brain stem, and then after leaving the skull, enter the upper neck area behind the ears, pass through the neck to the throat and vocal cords, to the heart, lungs, stomach, liver, kidney, spleen, gallbladder, pancreas, and finally to the small intestine and part of the large intestine. So we're talking about your entire digestive process, your ability to break down what you bring in, assimilate, use what you need, and release what you don't. As this nerve travels through the body, it regulates swallowing, vocalization, breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, immune responses, and even the microbiome of your intestines. Big, big, important piece of information here. Okay, so here is just an image so you can see. Right, so we're talking about autonomic processes here. Now, when we are overstimulated, Stress actually halts something called peristalsis. And peristalsis is just the contraction, the muscular pulses that are required for digestion. Okay, so again, the vagus nerve innervating the entire digestive channel, right? So when we are in a state of stress, it's a sign that when stress means that we have reached a state that, let me just pause this presentation for a minute. When we're in a state of stress, it means that there's so much stimulation coming in that we're unable to assimilate, to break down and assimilate our experience, keep what we need, and release what we don't need. Right? So when we're unable to do that within our nervous system, we're actually unable to do that in our body. So our digestive processes are completely compromised by overstimulation. Second, let's go back to the screen share. Okay. Now, stress also alters gut biome, including gut bacteria. This is huge because 95% of your body serotonin comes from gut bacteria. Okay, this is significantly altered by stress. This is a big deal because serotonin is needed for mood regulation. It's needed for a sense of belonging and connection, right? Low levels of serotonin are associated with depression and obsessive compulsive disorder, among many other mental health disorders. And we all know how, when we're in an OCD state, right, or we're feeling depressed, this wreaks havoc on our relationships and our personal lives. Also, when we are running on cortisol, just one stress hormone, when we have high levels of cortisol, it actually inhibits our brain's ability to uptake serotonin. Okay. So it's like a double whammy of one, we are actually inhibiting efficient production of serotonin, and then we're inhibiting the uptake of it, right? So very, very interesting here. All right. And then, of course, via the vagus nerve, stress and overstimulation affects our breathing. Big issue because lungs are the first defense of the body's immune system, right? And lungs actually also assist us in releasing gases that are emitted by the biome in our digestive system, right? So when we're unable to release the gases emitted by the biome, we can end up having things like SIBO, right? So small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So some of these diagnoses, again, it's like we could medicate it, or we could take a look at what is our lifestyle? What is our relationship to the world, to our work? What is our relationship to the stimulation that comes in from the world, right? If we can take a look at that relationship and modify that, then we might find that we can actually reverse and heal these conditions that we've been diagnosed with, right? Also, to have full breath, the diaphragm actually helps pump the lymphatics of the abdominal and pelvic region, right? So again, it helps us release and detoxify the body. So when we are living in a state of constant restricted or constricted breath, then we are building up toxicity in the body, which can lead to illness, disease, fatigue, etc. Right? So of course, this affects our immune system, right? Autoimmune issues, we usually see that there was an unusual level of stress or an unusually stressful event that took place just before the onset of the first autoimmune symptoms. So if you've been diagnosed with autoimmune, let's have a conversation. Let's evaluate your relationship with your environment, right? And see if we can track back the first symptoms and see what may have switched within your brain and your nervous system to create autoimmune. Because there are ways, again, when we modify our relationship with our environment, we are changing the entire process of what's taking place inside of our bodies, we're also able to change the expression of our genes, which means that just because your mother or your father had heart disease does not mean you're destined for heart disease. Gene expression is determined by your environment and your lifestyle choices. Yeah. So that's, thankful to the field of epigenetics research for revealing this truth to us. Okay. Also, when we're in an overstimulated state, because we are operating most often in that fight-flight state, when we're there, so many of our decisions are coming from fear and from scarcity, and we're really unable to access our higher mind, our intuitive decision-making abilities. Yeah, our rational mind actually goes offline when we're in a state of threat perception, right? Or fight or flight. Yeah, the rational mind, the neocortex, is not as available to guide and support our lives. Okay, so we talked about this a bit. Again, how overstimulation affects relationships. This is just kind of reiterating that. Here we see the polyvagal ladder again. And how overstimulation disrupts brain chemistry. All right, so we're talking about dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. I'm just going to go through this quite quickly because this is just, just a free informational class. But if you want to have a deeper dive into how this affects you in your life, let's do it. All right, so dopamine. The world that we're living in today is excessive stimulation, the phones, all the notifications, all the myriad ways that people can contact you in a day's time. And when we are in a state of anticipation, right? Anticipating that client to email us back and give us a yes, right? Anticipating the ridicule of a boss or a client when something didn't go well, anticipating the next registration for an event, anticipating the next email to land on our screen. In that state of constant anticipation, what we have is an excess of dopamine. We're getting hit with dopamine all day, right? And so this can actually lead to things like attention deficit disorder, ADHD. It can lead to screen addiction, right? Adrenaline addiction as well is also a piece of this. So we actually get addicted to the brain chemicals that are heightened or in excess because of our lifestyle. Now, what happens is that when you go home at night, right, and your partner wants to spend time with you, but you have been stuck in that anticipatory state all day, it's very challenging to just shut your mind off, right? And whenever those messages aren't coming through, or things slow down, or you're asked to put the phone away or quit talking about work, what happens is we're actually having a reduction in those dopamine hits, and it can feel like a depression. We can feel bored. We can feel totally disconnected. And this is where we get into this place of, people being very addicted to their identities and their professions. And, we get in those relationship dynamics where the partner just doesn't want to hear about work anymore, but to you, it's all there is, right? So just some food for thought. Serotonin, we already talked a bit about that. And then oxytocin. So oxytocin, there have been some studies that have suggested that screen time lowers your oxytocin, right? And oxytocin, it is a chemical that is secreted during childbirth. It is a chemical that we see during breastfeeding. It's called the love hormone, right? It's an intimacy hormone or an intimacy chemical. It is secreted when we're feeling feelings of love and romance, right? When we're really into somebody, or when we're really feeling connected to someone. It really helps to boost our oxytocin by having in-person connection, where we can very clearly see someone's facial expressions, where we can see the light and the energy emanating from their eyes, right? Where we can really feel their energy and we get our mirror neurons firing with theirs, right? Through body language and all of that, our mirror neurons are talking to theirs. And we find ourselves in this beautiful flow of connection and feeling and empathy. And that's where we're going to see oxytocin. You don't get that from excessive scrolling. You don't get that from constantly anticipating the next email and looking at a screen. So if your relationships are suffering or you're feeling like really disconnected from life and antisocial, it may be that there is a big disruption to your brain chemistry because of overstimulation or your relationship with the world. Before you let a therapist tell you that there's something inherently wrong with you, with your brain chemistry or with your genetics, before you believe that and really make that part of your identity, I invite you to stop and ask yourself, what is my relationship to my environment? Is that relationship affecting my brain chemistry and my nervous system? And can I make changes there, right? Can I make changes there that are going to enrich my life and the connections that I have versus just medicating a symptom that is probably going to break through in a matter of months or a year anyway, because your body is always trying to do what's best for you. It's always trying to communicate the message that it is needed for you to make the choices that are going to bring you into the most balance and harmony. And when we ignore that signal or we suppress that signal, the body will scream louder, right? Yeah. And that could be through another symptom or another diagnosis or illness. And you don't have to go down that pathway, right? I'm not saying, stop taking meds if you're on them, but I am inviting you to consider, what is the root cause? Does it exist in your lifestyle? And can you make some very empowering changes that's going to give you more longevity and that's going to actually help you be a stronger leader for longer? Not to mention enrich your relationships. Yeah. Okay. So we talked about this. Okay. So there's also in Chinese medicine, we look at Qi and Jing, and I'm not going to talk too much about that because it's kind of taking us out of the psychoneurology a bit. But this is something that we'll explore in upcoming sessions. It is something that we want to be mindful of, right? Qi is the energy that we get to build through rest, exercise, sleep, and nutrition. And when we don't have enough qi, we start using our Jing. And the Jing is the energy of your physical organs, right? So we actually start using up the body's vitality. And that's where we end up having the diagnosis of physical illness. So that's all something that we can talk about later. Okay. So tips and tools. I just want to break this down very simply for you. The most simple thing you can do when you notice that you're dysregulated or that you're operating from a fear-based state, right, is just pause and take 3 breaths. It only takes 3 breaths to shift your inner state. Okay, so that's one great tool there. Also, we need to be looking at if we're actually entering rest and digest before and after meals. So you could just start by taking those few breaths before your meals. After your meals, take a few breaths. Try not to multitask, okay? When your brain is processing and for other information, right? When your brain is someplace else while you're eating, then your body is also not fully processing and assimilating the food. It's not bringing in the nourishment and holding that, okay? It affects your digestive processes via the vagus nerve. So stay away from stimulation during mealtime. When you're eating with your friends and family, no screens allowed. Allow yourself to look them in the eyes, to feel their energy, to touch their hands, get the mirror neurons firing, get the oxytocin flowing, and rekindle those connections. Okay. Another tip, just turn off screens 2 hours before bed. Your brain and nervous system need time to finish processing the events of your day so that you can actually enter a state of rest and be ready and sleep, right? So try to turn those off at least 2 hours before bed. And then, of course, tracking your nervous system. So you can use the information I shared today to track your nervous system. But we do this in much more detail and in a way that's customized for you during our private sessions. So if that's something that you want to explore, a tool that you want to bring into your life, then make note of it now and send me an email right after this video so that we can get you started in the right direction. Okay. And then stay tuned because our next video is all about sensory connections. So these are going to be somatic, body-based approaches for balancing your left and right brain, for entering a state of presence, and for entering a state in which you're actually able to assimilate your experiences, right? Break them down, keep what you need, release what you don't. Okay, so that you can be nourished in your psyche and body, and so that you can be more alert and more available for the moments in your life that truly matter. Those moments with your loved ones that you're never going to get back. In January of this year, my mother passed away at quite a young age, right? And it just really showed me how quickly it all goes and how many regrets a person has when they're in that end of life. So it's not just about, self-care as a buzzword and stress management to manage anxiety. It's about quality of life. And sometimes when we are highly successful people, our success can blind us a bit to the fact that our life or something inside of us is craving more depth, more meaning, more connection in our lives. Okay? So bring this into your heart for your own healing and connection. And we'll see you soon for part 2, sensory connections.